Welcome to the Answers for Elders radio show. Meet the trusted experts who will give you straight answers and will help guide you on the path of later life care. Now, here's your host, founder, caregiver, and CEO, Suzanne Newman.
Welcome back, everyone, to Answers for Elders Radio Network. And we are here with the Vitality Revolution, talking about the 8 foundational principles of wellness. And here in the month of June, the first month, we are talking about physical and emotional wellness. And obviously, emotional wellness has a lot to do with forgiveness. And for those of you that missed our segment 1, please go back. I recommend you go back and listen, because this is kind of a part 2 of the program of what we started out. And we are here with Lori Hudson, who is an independent agent representing Humana. And Lori, you have a past of working with Humana. And I love the fact that Humana is our main sponsor, because Humana is a wellness company. That's who they are. And obviously you worked how many years for Humana before 17 years. And so obviously working in the whole Medicare arena and helping seniors, I love the approach that Humana makes in all the different ways in which they help in health and wellness. And we've been talking this podcast, this segment, first segment was all about forgiveness. I talked about an incident that was very personal to me, and just, I'm going to summarize. Please know that you can go back, but I had an accident that was not my fault when I was 22 years old, where a 14-year-old boy came into my car and he was killed instantly as I was driving on a country road. I went home and I called my mother, who was not in town, and she chose where she was as a priority over being with me as her daughter. And I held that resentment forever, from the time I was 22 years old all the way until a very, very long time in my 50s. And it affected my life. And certainly we are here with Lori, and we're talking about resentments and in the past. And I sure had my share of them. And so, Lori, thank you for helping me share this story. And this is a really good thing for me to talk a little bit about. How do you find resentments, and, how do you identify, I guess, if you're having resentments towards other, and how do you work towards releasing them? That's my question to you. I had my process, and I'm interested in yours.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And I so appreciate being here. I have to give the disclaimer that I'm not a licensed psychologist, psychiatrist. I'm just going off of my life experience with my clients. So I'm not giving medical advice. I think it really is important to get help and to figure out or acknowledge when you need that. And that is one thing that I do recommend with some of my clients, if I really feel like, if I'm working with them and I really feel like that's a necessary thing or a helpful thing for them. But I think, and we talked a little bit last time, but just realizing that you're doing it, I think, because I think we get into this pattern sometimes and we don't even realize that we're holding on to it. And I think sometimes, and as someone's insurance agent, and I go in and I might be meeting with someone and we're just talking some general things, I never ask about specifics. We're not allowed to just sit down with a health survey.
Of course not.
When we first meet somebody, but it's after doing it a while, it's kind of easy to pick up on that. And sometimes people don't even realize that they're doing it. They've had it for so long.
Sure.
And I think as an outside person, maybe asking a couple of questions, could just really bring that out and acknowledge. So I think that's the first thing is if you recognize it and acknowledge it. So that's first step, I think, for anybody. And, just going to looking at perspective, empathy, maybe a question would be, have you thought about how the other person feels, which may be a hot button, but I think it's important to think about that.
You know, what you're saying is so valid. But I think the other thing that we can certainly talk about is I went to counseling and I still didn't work through it in counseling because I wasn't ready yet to stop telling the story over and over in my head. My resentment towards my mother it was my loss because I then held a resentment towards her for 30 years, right? 35 years. And I think about how that all evolved, and what happened was the fact that it was more my story that was in my head that was affecting so many ways in which I was living my life. And it wasn't until I really got it. And I don't know, it was just an aha moment, but I realized that the more and more that I was telling this story, the only person I was hurting was myself. And the thing is, nobody out there can change that. I mean, I'd sit there and I think to myself, what could my mother have done to make it right for me that she was capable of? First of all, she's an independent human being. She, like we've talked about in a previous episode, the fact that, everybody has their own process and their way that they do things, right? And we as individuals, we certainly have ours. And nobody's perfect. We're all imperfect, human beings, right? So looking through this process, and as we're looking at it, it's like, how do we realize what's coming back at our life? Was I attracting people that were not trustworthy? Sure, because guess what? I was not trustworthy, because guess what? My mom let me down. So that means nobody else is going to be trustworthy. So I might as well just shut myself off. I think we tend to attract those of what we're, who we are right at the moment. And I'm not saying that that's not changing, but I think there's an element of, the more and more we tell these stories, the only thing it hurts is it's like a wound that keeps festering over and over. It doesn't help us be full human beings. And I'm going to talk to caregivers out there right now. There's so many family caregivers that are harboring resentments like I did. And, we're dealing with families that come apart at the seams because we may have resentments towards our siblings. We may have resentments towards our parents. We may have resentments towards, decisions that are being made in the result of the care that everyone comes together. And, the thing that we have to understand is, I guess the thing that I can say is it's the coping mechanism of, what I always say, it's not my sidewalk. It's my mom's choices, my mother's choices of her life. And that's where we intermingle ourselves, is when we get into trouble. Don't you agree, Lori?
Oh, I really agree with that. And I think a couple things that stood out. Well, one, when you were talking, I was thinking about the fact of releasing those expectations. So you're expecting your mom to act a certain way.
Absolutely.
I've had people in my life I expect to act a certain way, or come through on a certain thing, or whatever it is. And I think a lot of times we're expecting people to behave the way that we would in that situation, and that's a huge thing, and we have to let go of that. And some of the things you were talking about, that can can manifest itself in physical issues. So if we're holding on to all of that, our mental well-being, that can manifest in physical ways. And so it's really important to think about just releasing those expectations and realizing, like you said, you are who you are. She is who she is, and she did not behave in the way that you expected her to. Would have in that situation. So I think that is very important to try to think about. And then the other thing I would say too is certain triggers. So if you have that resentment and there's something that triggers it, maybe a place, or, whatever it is, to maybe work towards either, or maybe it's a person. There's a person that you interact with that is triggering those resentments. So limit your contact with that person, or, just don't go to that place. If there's a certain place that triggers that, maybe, work towards avoiding that as much as possible.
Yeah. And I think too, what you're saying, in this whole process of how do we forgive and how do we let go? Forgiveness, and I'm going to repeat it again, it does not excuse the wrong that was done to you. The only thing it does is it releases you from your attachment to it that makes it run your life. And that's the thing that I think is so powerful. How I reached my level of forgiveness is, first of all, when I was called to take care of my mother, I saw this fierce that, force to be reckoned with, which I constantly viewed her as, until I walked into that hospital room and I saw this vulnerable little old lady laying there that was hurt. And all of a sudden, I don't know what shifted in me, but I've talked about this on my show. The fact that all of a sudden caregiver came into my life. I became that caregiver and I became that person that it was my duty to care for her. And then I realized that there's so much more value in focusing on the positive of, how can I make her life better? And I realized I don't need this story in my life anymore. And yes, I needed to work through it. And luckily my mom, bless her heart, at 84 years old, 85 years old at the time, we went to a therapist, and we had an amazing therapist that, and I had to have her hear me about why I was hurt. And before, and when she started to defend herself, the therapist stopped and said, "This is her story. You need to hear her. Don't turn around and defend yourself. That's not taking it in." And I think one of the things, when my mom really got how it, affected me, then it became, healing was begin to, became forward. I was lucky to be able to work that through with her. And at the end of her life, I was closer to her than I'd ever been to any human being in my life. And now I obviously am probably that way with my husband. But the thing that I think is so valuable is the fact that, first of all, understand that we're all innocent people. I believe that. I'm not saying that there aren't people that intentionally do bad things. I'm not saying that. But as a result, I believe that everyone, if, for the most part, if they hurt other people, it's not an intentional direction. And then the other thing is it doesn't serve you as an individual to hang on to it. Do you have any tips on how to let go of resentments, Lori?
Well, I think, again, just trying to put yourself in the other person's position, and with your mom, it could be that she put up that really hard shell and she was sticking with that story, and that was her protection. And I think sometimes you, as a human, forgiving the other person, that puts a little crack in that shell for them. It helps you, but it may impact that other person in a big way.
Yeah.
And one example, and this is so off topic, but I think that when you think about here in our area, there was the famous serial killer Gary Ridgway, who killed I don't even know how many young women, and then and their families had to go through that whole process and the whole thing, and his sentencing, and people, the witness statements, and people getting up there and just ripping him apart, and he just sat there, just stone cold face.
Yeah.
And then one person got up and said, "I forgive you,"
I
and then
remember,
he
and
cracked.
yeah.
And even people like that do horrible things, there's something inside there, we don't know what it is. But just that us taking that step, it helps ourselves, but also with that other person. You really helped your mom in forgiving her.
Well, and I think too that, it's interesting, when I was sharing my story, I could still feel the hurt. That hurt is going to still be there. The difference is where you can still feel hurt without blame and judgment, and that's the thing. It's a part of me. It'll always be a part of me. That was a traumatic experience, right? And certainly I don't ever talk about it because it's not something I want to dwell on for obvious reasons. But I do think that, I don't have to take that blame to her. And that's the point that I'm making, is taking it back and saying, you know what? I can still feel hurt by something, and I'm going to work on healing myself from it and living with the disappointments or the tragedies or whatever those are. We are all human beings, but we can do it. We can tell the truth about what happened without blame or judgment. And I think that also helps us in our relationships with people. There's times that I've had to talk to my husband about things that I was angry with. And I've learned that, I make an observation. This is what's going on. Okay. How do you think we can solve this together? How can we work together to do this? So in other words, saying, I acknowledge that you're going to have a different way of doing this project or doing this, but or handling this, but it's not working for me. So how can we make it work for both of us? And that's part of that dynamic of working with a family, saying, I understand you want mom to live with you, and I get that. Here's my challenge with that. And I know that, how can we work together? And I think that's the thing of telling the truth, but at the same time, don't place it all on other people. Learn to build a bridge, right? I guess
Right.
that's
And
what
if
I'm
you
saying.
did have some part of it, like your situation, you really didn't have any part in that. That accident was out of your control. But if we do have some piece of it ourselves, I think it's important to acknowledge that, because the other person puts up the shell, you put up the shell, and then you just don't get anywhere. So I think acknowledging your part of it and forgiving yourself, which is a process in itself, but that can make a big difference as well.
Yeah. Lori, you're so right. And certainly, I wish for each and every one of you that are listening today to think about, how you can release your attachment to things that have hurt you. And I would love on social media, if you listen to this podcast, share it and think about how, what are ways that you can forgive. I know I'm going to definitely share this one on my personal Facebook page. I think it's important that we all look at, how we can have a better life moving forward. And certainly forgiveness is a huge piece of it. And Lori, thank you so much for bringing this topic forward. I know I kind of dominated this whole thing, but it was an important episode for me. And I am very grateful to you for this.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And
Yeah. And so for each and every one of you, Lori, how does everybody reach you?
Well, the best way is my website, and that is HudsonInsuranceSolutions.com. And it's Hudson with a T, HUTSON, insurancesolutions.com. And I'm licensed in the state of Washington. So I work with Medicare beneficiaries here in our state via either in person, on the phone, Zoom. If you're out of state, if you go to my website and fill out the contact me form, I can put you in touch with an agent in your local area.
Perfect. And special thanks again to Humana for sponsoring the Vitality Revolution. And thank you again, Lori. And we are going to be back with more episodes right after this. We at Answers for Elders thank you for listening. Did you know that you can discover hundreds of podcasts in our library on senior care? So visit our website and discover our decision guides that will help you also navigate decision making. Find us at answersforelders.com.